Does crime pay in Brazil? The case of Araceli. In the humid coastal city of Vitória, Brazil, where palm trees sway in the Atlantic breeze and wealthy families have ruled for generations, a crime so heinous occurred that it would expose the rotten core of Brazilian justice for decades to come. On May 18, 1973, 8-year-old Araceli Cabrera Sanchez Crespo disappeared from the streets near her home, vanishing into a nightmare that would reveal how money, power and influence can transform the most brutal crimes into mere inconveniences for those wealthy enough to buy their way out of consequences. What happened to Araceli in the final hours of her short life was so savage, so depraved, that even hardened investigators struggled to process the evidence. But what happened afterward, the systematic corruption of justice, the manipulation of witnesses, the casual dismissal of overwhelming evidence, would prove that in Brazil, crime doesn't just pay, it pays extraordinarily well for those who can afford the right lawyers, judges and politicians. The story of Araceli is not just the tale of a murdered child. It is a damning indictment of a justice system so corrupted by wealth and privilege that it transforms victims into statistics and murderers into martyrs. It is the story of how two wealthy young men could drug, rape, torture, and murder an innocent child, then walk free to live lives of luxury and comfort, while their victim's family was left to grieve in poverty and obscurity. For nearly 50 years, the name Araceli has been synonymous with injustice in Brazil. Her case became a symbol of everything wrong with a system that promises equal justice under law, but delivers protection for the wealthy and persecution for the poor. The men who killed her not only escaped punishment, but were transformed by the media and legal system into victims of a witch hunt, while the real victim, a brutalized 8-year-old girl, was forgotten by everyone except her devastated family. This is the story of how crime pays in Brazil, told through the lens of one of the most shocking miscarriages of justice in Latin American history. The victim, Araceli Cabrera Sanchez Crespo. Araceli was born on July 2, 1964 in São Paulo to a working-class family that struggled to make ends meet in Brazil's rapidly industrializing economy. Her father worked in construction, her mother took in laundry and cleaned houses for wealthy families. They were the kind of people who worked hard, paid their taxes, and believed that if they followed the rules and stayed out of trouble, the system would protect them and their children. They were tragically wrong. When Araceli was still a toddler, her family moved to Vitória, the capital of Espírito Santo state, seeking better opportunities in the booming coastal economy. Vitória was a city of stark contrasts, gleaming high-rises and luxury condominiums for the wealthy, sprawling favelas and cramped apartments for everyone else. The Crespo family fell firmly into the latter category, renting a small house in a working-class neighborhood where children played in the streets and everyone knew their neighbors. Araceli was a bright, curious child with dark eyes and a ready smile. She loved to draw and dreamed of becoming a teacher when she grew up. Her teachers described her as intelligent and well-behaved, though sometimes shy around strangers. She was the kind of child who helped her mother with household chores without being asked, who shared her toys with younger children, who brought home stray cats and begged her parents to let her keep them. On the morning of May 18, 1973, Araceli left her house to visit her grandmother, a routine trip she had made dozens of times before. The walk was less than a mile through familiar streets, past shops and houses where she knew the owners. It should have been safe. This was her neighborhood, her community, the place where she had lived most of her short life. But Vitória in 1973 was a city where wealthy young men believed they could take whatever they wanted without consequences. Araceli had the misfortune to cross paths with two such men on what should have been an ordinary Friday afternoon. She never made it to her grandmother's house. Instead, she was lured into a car by men who saw her not as a human being, with hopes and dreams, and people who loved her, but as an object to be used for their twisted pleasure and then discarded like garbage. The perpetrators: Paolo Constantin Helal and Dante de Barros Michelini. Paolo Constantin Helal was 24 years old in 1973, the son of one of Espirito Santo's most prominent families. His father owned construction companies, real estate developments, and had extensive political connections throughout the state. Paolo had grown up believing that rules were for other people, that his family's wealth and influence made him untouchable. He had a history of violence against women, including several incidents that had been quietly covered up by his family's lawyers and political allies. Dante de Barros Michelini, known as Dantinho, was even more privileged. At just 18 years old, he was already showing signs of the psychopathic tendencies that would make him capable of unimaginable cruelty. His family owned newspapers, radio stations, and had connections to the military government that ruled Brazil with an iron fist. Dantinho had been expelled from several private schools for violent behavior, but his family's influence ensured that these incidents never appeared on any official records. Both men moved in the same social circles: exclusive clubs, private parties, gatherings where wealthy young people could indulge their worst impulses without fear of consequences. They shared a contempt for the poor, a belief that people like Araceli's family existed solely for their amusement and exploitation. They had been raised to believe that their wealth and family connections made them superior to ordinary Brazilians. On the afternoon of May 18, 1973, Paolo and Dantinho were driving through Vitoria in Paolo's expensive imported car when they spotted Araceli walking alone. What happened next was not a crime of opportunity or passion. It was the calculated act of predators who had been planning something like this for months. They approached Araceli with a story about needing directions, then offered her a ride. When she refused, they grabbed her and forced her into the car. What Paolo and Dantinho did to Araceli over the next several hours was so brutal that even today, 50 years later, the full details have never been publicly released. They took her to a secluded house owned by Paolo's family, where they drugged her, sexually assaulted her repeatedly, tortured her for their own amusement, and finally killed her when they grew tired of their game. The crime: a descent into depravity. The details of what happened to Araceli on May 18, 1973, are so horrific that they challenge our understanding of human nature and the depths of evil that people can reach when they believe themselves to be above all consequences. The forensic evidence revealed a level of cruelty and sadism that shocked even experienced investigators who had dealt with the worst kinds of violent crime. Paolo and Dantinho took Araceli to a secluded house owned by Paolo's family, a property that had been prepared in advance for their twisted purposes. They had planned this crime carefully, gathering supplies and ensuring they would not be interrupted. This was not a spontaneous act of violence, but a calculated torture session that they had been fantasizing about for months. The first thing they did was drug her with a combination of alcohol and sedatives, substances that would make her compliant while keeping her conscious enough to experience everything they planned to do to her. What followed was hours of systematic sexual abuse and torture. The forensic evidence showed that Araceli was assaulted repeatedly by both men, subjected to acts of violence that were clearly designed to cause maximum pain and humiliation. But the sexual assault was only the beginning. Paolo and Dantinho seemed to take particular pleasure in terrorizing their victim, in watching her fear and pain. They made her beg for her life, promised to let her go if she cooperated, then laughed at her desperation. They took photographs of their crimes, souvenirs that they could use to relive their twisted triumph later. When they finally grew tired of torturing Araceli, they faced the problem of what to do with her. They couldn't let her live. She had seen their faces, knew their names, could identify them to police. Their solution was as brutal as everything else they had done. They strangled Araceli slowly, taking pleasure in watching the life leave her eyes. But even death wasn't enough to satisfy their cruelty. They mutilated her body, disfiguring her face and genitals in an attempt to make identification difficult. Then they poured acid over her corpse, hoping to destroy DNA evidence and make forensic analysis impossible. Finally, they dumped her body in a remote area outside Vitoria, in a location where they believed it would never be found. The discovery and investigation, corruption from the start. For 6 agonizing days, Araceli's family searched desperately for their missing daughter. Her parents contacted police immediately when she failed to return home, but their concerns were dismissed with the casual indifference that Brazilian authorities typically showed toward missing children from poor families. The police suggested that Araceli had probably run away, and they showed little interest in conducting a serious investigation. On May 24, 1973, Araceli's body was discovered by children playing in a remote area outside Vitoria. The scene was so horrific that several experienced officers became physically ill. The body was barely recognizable as human due to the acid damage and mutilation, but dental records confirmed this was Araceli. The forensic examination revealed the full extent of the horrors that Araceli had endured. The evidence of sexual assault was overwhelming. The torture marks told a story of prolonged suffering. The cause of death was strangulation, but the condition of the body made it clear that death had been a mercy after hours of unimaginable torment. The investigation that followed was a masterclass in corruption. Rather than treating this as the horrific crime it obviously was, authorities approached the case with a clear agenda: protect the real perpetrators while creating the appearance of a thorough investigation. The lead investigator assigned to the case had close ties to the families of the suspected perpetrators. Within hours of the body's discovery, witnesses began reporting that they had seen Araceli getting into a luxury car on the day of her disappearance. Several people provided detailed descriptions that matched Paulo Constantin Helal and his expensive imported automobile. But rather than following up on these leads immediately, investigators seemed determined to ignore or discredit them. The forensic evidence was equally damning, but much of it mysteriously disappeared from police custody or was contaminated beyond usefulness. Meanwhile, Paulo and Antinho were using their family's resources to construct elaborate alibis and destroy any remaining evidence. They hired the best lawyers money could buy and launched a sophisticated public relations campaign designed to portray their sons as victims of a rush to judgment. Witnesses who had seen Araceli getting into Paulo's car began changing their stories or refusing to cooperate with investigators. Some reported being threatened or bribed to keep quiet. Others simply disappeared, leaving the area suddenly and without explanation. The first trial. Justice denied. When Paulo Constantin Helal and Dante de Barros Michelini finally went to trial in 1980, 7 years after Araceli's murder, the proceedings were a farce that made a mockery of everything the justice system was supposed to represent. The trial was less about determining guilt or innocence than about providing a forum for the defendant's expensive lawyers to demonstrate their skill at manipulating the legal system. The prosecution seemed more interested in going through the motions than in actually convicting the defendants. The evidence was presented half-heartedly, without the passion and commitment that such a horrific crime deserved. The defense, by contrast, was a masterpiece of legal manipulation and victim-blaming. The defendants' lawyers argued that their clients were being persecuted because of their wealth and social status. More disgustingly, they attempted to blame Araceli herself for her own murder. They suggested that she had been involved in prostitution despite being only 8 years old, that she had willingly gotten into the car with her killers. This victim-blaming strategy was not only morally reprehensible, but legally irrelevant. The trial was conducted in an atmosphere of intimidation and corruption. Witnesses who testified against the defendants faced harassment and threats. Jurors were approached by representatives of the defendants' families and offered bribes or threatened with consequences if they voted to convict. The media coverage was heavily slanted in favor of the defendants. Despite all of this corruption, the evidence against Paulo and Dantinho was so overwhelming that even a compromised jury couldn't ignore it entirely. Paulo was convicted and sentenced to 18 years in prison, while Dantinho received a 5-year sentence. But even these inadequate punishments were more than the corrupt system was willing to allow. The convictions were immediately appealed, and the defendants' families used their political connections to ensure that the appeals would be heard by sympathetic judges. Within months, it became clear that the convictions would not stand. The fix was in, and everyone involved knew it. The appeal and second trial. The final insult. The appeal process was a masterclass in how wealth and influence can corrupt even the highest levels of the justice system. The defendants' families didn't just hire lawyers, they bought judges, prosecutors, and politicians who could ensure that their sons would never face real consequences for their crimes. The appellate court ruled that the original trial had been so flawed that the convictions could not stand, and they ordered a new trial. The years between the overturned convictions and the new trial were used by the defendants' families to further corrupt the system and eliminate any remaining evidence of their son's guilt. The 1991 retrial was the final insult to Araceli's memory and her family's quest for justice. After 18 years of corruption, intimidation, and cover-up, the case had been transformed into a legal circus where the defendants were portrayed as victims and the real victim was forgotten. The prosecution in the second trial was even weaker than in the first. Key witnesses had disappeared, died, or changed their stories. Physical evidence had been lost or destroyed. The defense had used the 18 years between trials to perfect their strategy of victim blaming and misdirection. The trial was conducted in an atmosphere where the defendants were treated as celebrities rather than accused killers. They arrived at court each day in expensive suits, surrounded by teams of lawyers and supporters. The jury deliberated for less than a day before returning verdicts of not guilty on all charges. The acquittals were met with celebration from the defendants' families, who portrayed the verdicts as a victory for justice. But for anyone who understood what had really happened, the acquittals were a devastating blow to the concept of justice itself. 2 men who had brutally tortured, raped, and murdered an innocent 8-year-old girl had not only escaped punishment, but had been officially declared innocent. The aftermath and legacy, institutionalized impunity, the acquittal of Paulo Constantin Helal and Dante de Barros. Michelini in 1991 marked the end of the legal proceedings. But it was also the beginning of a broader reckoning with the corruption that had made such a miscarriage of justice possible. The case had exposed the Brazilian justice system as fundamentally broken, a system where wealth and influence mattered more than evidence and truth. Araceli's family was left devastated by the acquittals. They had spent 18 years fighting for justice, only to watch their daughter's killers walk free while being celebrated as victims of persecution. The broader Brazilian public was also deeply affected, with many seeing the outcome as confirmation of their worst suspicions about their country's justice system. The case became a symbol of everything wrong with Brazilian society: the extreme inequality, the corruption of institutions, the impunity enjoyed by the wealthy elite. Paulo and Dantinho returned to their privileged lives as if nothing had happened, showing no remorse for what they had done, no acknowledgement of the pain they had caused. The Araceli case didn't just expose corruption, it institutionalized it. The successful cover-up sent a clear message to other wealthy criminals that they could commit even the most heinous crimes without fear of real consequences. In the years following the acquittals, Brazil saw a series of similar cases where wealthy defendants escaped justice through corruption and legal manipulation. The case also had a chilling effect on law enforcement. Investigators and prosecutors learned that challenging powerful families could destroy their careers. Many chose to avoid such cases entirely, while others approached them with the understanding that their job was to go through the motions rather than to actually seek justice. Despite the failure of the justice system, Araceli's story has had a lasting impact on Brazilian society. In 2000, the Brazilian Congress officially designated May 18, the anniversary of Araceli's murder, as the National Day for the Combat of Abuse and Sexual Exploitation of Children and Adolescents. Her case is studied in law schools as an example of how not to conduct an investigation, and her memory serves as a reminder of the human cost of institutional failure. Conclusion: the price of injustice. 50 years after Araceli Cabrera Sanchez Crespo was brutally murdered by two wealthy young men, her killers are still free, still living lives of privilege and comfort, still protected by the same system that failed to provide justice for their victim. They have never expressed remorse for their crime, never acknowledged the pain they caused, never faced any meaningful consequences for taking the life of an innocent child. The case of Araceli provides a definitive answer to the question of whether crime pays in Brazil. For those with enough wealth and influence, crime doesn't just pay, it pays extraordinarily well. Paulo Constantine Helal and Dante de Barros Michelini committed one of the most brutal crimes imaginable, and not only did they escape punishment, they were ultimately declared innocent by a system they had corrupted beyond recognition. Their success in avoiding accountability was not due to lack of evidence or reasonable doubt about their guilt. It was the result of systematic corruption of every level of the justice system. They used their families' wealth to buy investigators, prosecutors, judges, and politicians who ensured that justice would never be served. The cost of this corruption extends far beyond Araceli's family. It has created a culture of impunity where wealthy criminals feel free to commit increasingly serious crimes, knowing that their money and connections will protect them. It has also created a sense of hopelessness among ordinary citizens who see no point in reporting crimes when they know the system is rigged against them. The case serves as a stark reminder that justice delayed is justice denied. But more than that, it shows how corruption can transform a justice system into an instrument of oppression rather than protection. When the wealthy can buy their way out of accountability for even the most heinous crimes, the entire concept of equal justice under law becomes meaningless. Until Paulo Constantine Helal and Dante de Barros Michelini face consequences for their crimes, until the system that protected them is reformed, until justice is finally served for Araceli Cabrera Sanchez Crespo, Brazil will remain a country where crime pays and justice is for sale to the highest bidder. Her memory deserves better, her family deserves better, and the Brazilian people deserve better than a system that protects killers while abandoning victims. The fight for justice continues, and Araceli's name remains a symbol of hope that someday, somehow, the truth will prevail and accountability will be restored to a system that has been corrupted for far too long.